Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. Peter Dodds came to my attention through another guest, Terry Bach, who appeared with us from the Search Finders Group, a group designed to assist adoptees to contact their birth parents. Peter had recently published the story of his own international adoption. In fact, we have his book tonight, Outer Search and Inner Journey. His subsequent search for not just his German birth parents, but ultimately his search for his own identity was the basis for this incredibly informative book. Peter struggled with his identity as a child born in Germany and brought to the U.S. by American military parents who raised him to be an American. As a result, there were some pieces missing for him. Tonight, we have the opportunity to address international adoption from his perspective and by addressing some poignant issues to consider before taking such a step. Peter, I want to thank you for joining me this evening. I know that you've had to fly down from Seattle, so I'm certainly honored that you would do that.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Mary.
I appreciate you coming. And as I mentioned, we do have your book here, Outer Search and Inner Journey. And this was published, it hasn't been very long, it's been a year or two?
Came out in April of this year.
April of this year, okay. And I know one of the unique things about this, when we talked originally, was that this was one of the first books written regarding international adoption, particularly from the adoptee's point of view.
Right. It's the first book written on international adoption by a foreign-born adoptee, and one of the reasons I wrote the book was to introduce the voice of the foreign-born adoptee on subjects of international adoption, a voice that has not yet been introduced in discussions here in the United States.
You know, I noticed that because I was studying, and in addition to reading your book, I was looking up some other facts, and what I found on the internet is that everything I looked up was actually not from your perspective. It was from the person adopting's perspective. So apparently, it's good this has been introduced because there's not a lot out there to help people really understand your perspective. Was it hard to write?
Well, hopefully an author, when she or he writes, has a message to say, and I had two of them in writing this book, Mary. First, there's a message of hope to anyone, whether they're adopted or not, that it is possible to overcome tremendous emotional and psychological obstacles and find inner peace. And I did that by sharing my experience and being as honest as I could in my own lives. The second reason I wrote the book is to shed light on the damage caused children by taking them from their country and culture of origin. And I hope to reach parents who may consider adoption, social workers, mental health professionals, as well as public policymakers and attorneys. There's been, what is written in the United States primarily comes from the perspective of American adults, and American adults who are connected to the international adoption industry. So it's very difficult to get an objective view of what's going on with international adoption, but there are pieces, and when put together, a very disturbing picture arises, and I'd like to share 4 of those with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
First, in September of this past year, a woman named Renee Pohlreis, who is a mother who adopted a child out of a Russian orphanage, was sentenced to 22 years in prison for murdering him. Renee Pohlreis said that her son was a demon and that she feared for her life. Her son was 2 years old. In July of this past year, Richard and Karen Thorne of Phoenix, Arizona, were arrested at John F. Kennedy Airport in Washington, D.C. on a flight from Moscow returning to the United States for beating their 2 children on the flight, 2 4-year-old Russian girls that they had adopted out of a Russian orphanage. Now, why were these children acting out? Well, probably they didn't speak English, and probably the Thornes didn't speak Russian. A third case in point is during World War II and immediately afterwards, several thousand British children were sent from Britain to Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Well, these children are now adults, and they have formed support organizations. And they have petitioned the British government asking that they formally apologize to them for removing them from their culture of origin. And the last case I'd like to point out is that there was a front page article on the New York Times, July 23rd, 1996. And the title of the article was "When Children Adopted Abroad Come with Too Many Troubles." And this article highlighted problems American parents are having with children they've adopted out of Russia and Eastern Europe, children who are unable to adjust emotionally and socially to their new environments.
Okay. Well, those are certainly all pretty powerful examples. The first one, in the woman who saw the child as a demon. Can you help us, what's the process? I mean, is there mental health screening for potential parents, or?
Well, at a minimum, what the Paul Rice case shows is that the adoption system failed that little boy.
Okay.
Now, what hasn't also been introduced, and it's unfortunate because parents who have adopted internationally or who might consider adopting internationally are one of the losers, as well as the children who suffer from lost culture, heritage, and language. Yeah. And for me, I acted out as a young boy growing up, and I was born to a German mother and a German father on German soil. At the age of 1, my birth mother relinquished me to an orphanage. 2 years later, I was adopted by American parents. And the loss of culture, heritage, language, and history caused me a great deal of emptiness inside. And now all adoptees, to some extent, have this. And I was never able to form close attachments to my adopting parents. I acted out as a child growing up. My parents didn't know what to do. It was in the 50s and 60s, and they were told that if you just love a child enough, all of their problems will go away, which is not true. So I am very familiar with that. Now, what happened is those emotions followed me into adulthood. And I had a very difficult time forming close relationships with women in romantic relationships. I was searching for, who am I? Am I American or am I German? I thought that by finding my birth mother, those questions would be answered. I found my birth mother, and I found her in a state-run institution because alcoholism had severely hampered her ability to live a normal life. I never met my birth father. He died of alcoholism before I met him. But finding my birth mother was better than not knowing. And one of the privileges I had, unlike American adoptees, is that I knew my birth mother's name and address, and I went to the town to find her. Americans in most states are prevented legally from getting access to their original and unamended birth certificate.
Okay, yeah, I believe the process is that parents have to sort of put their name out as they're willing to meet their children if their children come looking for them.
Right.
Now, leaving your country at the age of 3 would mean that you would have some very definite or some level of recognition, that you weren't where you started. I mean,
Correct.
I would think.
Correct.
How did you, because did your parents speak German?
They did not.
They did not. So how were you able to, as a child, talk about that? Or did you even try?
Well, I was unable to communicate to my adoptive parents because they couldn't speak German and I couldn't speak English. And this scene is replayed over and over and over again in international adoptions today. And it's a period of tremendous grief and loss for the adoptee, for the child. And they have no way to express their grief and anger and confusion. There's been research done on people who are deaf. If they're placed in an environment where they cannot speak to other people through sign language, that they suffer varying levels of emotional and psychological stress. Well, the same obviously is going to happen to the child. I think other points of interest on international adoption that are not discussed in this country is the concerns of countries that allow foreigners to adopt their children. For example, African nations, for the most part, do not sanction the adoption of their children to foreign nations. They see it as a form of neocolonialism. There's a widespread view in Latin America also that international adoption takes the children who are most suited in terms of age, health, and racial status and leaves harder to place children behind in the orphanages. One of the claims made by supporters of international adoption is that they are rescuing children.
Right.
Supporters of international adoption are quiet about the hundreds of thousands of abandoned and neglected and abused children who are not adopted and left behind, as well as the children here in the United States that are in need of a permanent home, and they're quiet about those children.
Well, and that brings up a point, because I know one of the controversies in American adoption has to do with the cultural issue. I mean, you know, do you take a child, I mean, not to mention another country, but even from another African-American child, and adopt an African-American child into a Caucasian family? Or so I would think if that itself is a controversy, if you add on top of that a whole nother heritage and culture, I mean, I could see where there would definitely need to be some discussion about the consequences of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's interesting to note that North American Indian organizations or tribes have formed organizations to repatriate their children who have been severed from the tribe through adoption, and the National Association of Black Social Workers in 1986 issued a position statement vehemently opposing the adoption of black children into non-black families, and they argued that these children would suffer serious problems of identity formation later in life, and that they would not be able to gain coping mechanisms to deal with societal racism. And it's just impossible for white people to understand that, just as it's impossible for Americans to truly understand what it's like to be German. And I didn't have the race issue to deal with. I'm often, at times, accused of being an isolated case. I'm accused of being a, quote, demon by some in the international adoption industry because I am trying to just simply introduce a voice that has yet been heard into discussions of international adoption. But it's very interesting to note that I was at the second World Congress on Family Law and the Rights of Children and Youth that was held in San Francisco, as a matter of fact, this past June. And while I was there, I was talking with an attorney who was from Australia, and he was an Aborigine who had been adopted by a white family in Australia, and he talked about his loss of culture and identity. And I shared with him my feelings, and we knew exactly what the other was talking about.
Okay, so this is really, when you meet each other, a shared experience,
Exactly.
a shared consciousness.
Exactly.
So it could be that some of the resistance to what you're saying, again, is that lack of shared experience. I mean, it's from the outside, it's like, well, you know, but gee, you would be taken out of an orphanage, you'd be given everything you needed, you'd be sent to good schools, your parents would have money, you know, and so there may be that sense, well, that should make up for
Correct.
it.
Correct.
Yeah.
And international adoption is incredibly complex. That's one perspective. There are many other perspectives on international adoption, and that's what I'm trying to introduce. It's interesting also that International Social Services in Geneva, Switzerland, a man named Damien Gabonziza, who's programs officer there, illustrates that one of the problems with international adoption is that it is inherently complex, and that most Americans are viewing it through a Eurocentric framework, and that is not the framework of other countries.
Yeah, so then we have some mind shift even to the process. We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. When we return, we'll see that there is more to consider in this important decision. Welcome back. We've been discussing with Peter Dodds his perspective on international adoption, and we've talked about some of the difficulty children might have and some of the confusion. I mean, you mentioned your parents also didn't know what the problem was.